Let's look at question number 11. We're looking for an assumption that the argument depends on. So the argument says, the chorus in a play, just like the narrator in a novel, introduces a point of view that isn't tied to any of the specific characters, and both these two things, chorus and narrator, allow the author to comment on the character's actions and to introduce information about the context of those actions. However, and here's where the argument actually starts. This is commonly the case on the LSAT, where the first two-thirds of the paragraph is just giving you some background information. They're just telling you some information about the chorus and the narrator. But now the whole argument is really in this last sentence. The argument is saying, however, since the information introduced by the chorus in a play is sometimes inconsistent with the rest of the information in the play, since support, comma, conclusion. Since that is true, therefore, conclusion, the chorus in a play is not equivalent to the narrator in a novel. So the word since introduces a reason, a support for something. So in this case, it's since support, comma, conclusion. That's the entire argument, is all in this last sentence, support and conclusion. And as with any assumption question, whenever we want to find the assumption of an argument, the assumption is always if support, then conclusion. That's always what's being assumed in every argument. So in this case, the support is that the chorus is sometimes inconsistent with the rest of the play, and then we use that as support to say the conclusion that therefore the chorus must not be equivalent to the narrator, right? So we're assuming that if it's inconsistent with the rest of the play, then it cannot be equivalent to the narrator. In other words, we're assuming, another way of saying that is that we're assuming that the narrator is never inconsistent with the rest of the novel, right? Because if it were, then why would this conclusion make sense, right? If the narrator of the novel was also sometimes inconsistent, then how would this conclusion follow? How would we know that they're not equivalent? They would be equivalent, right? So since we're using this as evidence that they're not equivalent, it must be that we're assuming that the narrator in the novel is different, is not equivalent in this way. So we're saying that the chorus is sometimes inconsistent with the information in the rest of the play, and then we're assuming that that proves that the narrator is different, that it's different than the narrator of a novel. So in other words, that's another way of saying that we're assuming that the narrator of the novel is never inconsistent with the rest of the information in the novel. And that's what would prove this conclusion, that the two things are not equivalent, right? So that's what we're looking for in the answer choices. The assumption is very simply that the narrator in a novel is always consistent with the rest of the information in the novel. So let's look for that. A, does this argument assume that the narrator of a novel is never deceptive? Now, we said that the argument is assuming that the narrator in a novel never presents information that's inconsistent with the rest of the novel. That's not necessarily the same thing as being deceptive, right? You could have one without the other. You could be deceptive while presenting information that's consistent with the rest of the novel, right? So the information could be consistent with the rest of the novel, but it could be false information. It could be presented deceptively. Or vice versa. You could be not being deceptive while presenting information that's inconsistent with the rest of the novel, right? It could be that you're presenting true, non-deceptive information, but it's inconsistent with something else that was said in the novel. So these two things are not the same thing. Deceptive and inconsistent are not the same, and therefore A is not the assumption that we are looking for. B, do we have to assume that a narrator's voice is sometimes necessary in plays that also have a chorus? Why would we have to assume that, right? The argument is trying to prove that these two things are not equivalent. Why would that mean we have to assume that sometimes you have plays that need both of these two things? Sometimes you need plays that need both a chorus and also a narrator. Something requiring two things has nothing to do with whether those two things are equivalent to each other or not, right? And also, this would be a narrator in a play. The argument is about being equivalent to the narrator in a novel. So this isn't even the same thing, right? A narrator in a play is not what the argument's about. The argument's about a narrator in a novel, right? So anyway, few reasons why B is totally irrelevant, and very simply, it's not the assumption that we're looking for, which had to do with whether a narrator can present inconsistent information. C, do we have to assume that necessary information in a play, in order for the audience to understand the events, is sometimes introduced by the chorus? In other words, the chorus sometimes presents necessary information in a play. Why would that have to be assumed to prove our conclusion that a chorus is not equivalent to the narrator of a novel, right? It could be that a narrator in a novel also presents necessary information, or it could be that the narrator in the novel doesn't present necessary information, right? This has nothing to do with the argument, right? We're trying to prove that they're not equivalent. So C is saying, well, you have to assume that the chorus sometimes presents necessary information. Why would that prove that it's not equivalent to the narrator of a novel, right? So, because maybe the narrator of the novel also produces necessary information, in which case it makes them, yes, equivalent, not equivalent, right? So we don't know, therefore C is totally irrelevant. It's not the assumption that we were looking for. That's another very simple reason we can cross it off right away. D tells us that information that a narrator introduces in a novel is never inconsistent with the rest of the novel's information. That's exactly what we were looking for, right? That's exactly the assumption that we need that's going to prove our conclusion, because our conclusion is trying to say that the narrator in a novel is not equivalent to the chorus of a play. And the evidence brought for that is because the chorus of the play sometimes produces inconsistent information. So in order to use that to prove the conclusion, we have to be assuming that the narrator of a novel never produces inconsistent information. And that would prove the conclusion. That would mean that they're not equivalent to each other. We have to assume that in order for this argument to make sense. Therefore, D is correct. E gives us information about choruses in plays. E says that authors sometimes use choruses in plays to deceive the audience. But without knowing whether narrators in novels also do that, this doesn't tell us anything about whether the two things are equivalent, right? We're trying to prove whether these two things are equivalent or not. Narrators in novels and choruses in plays. So if you tell me something about choruses in plays, the only way that that would be helpful in proving that they're not equivalent is if I know that the opposite is true in the case of narrators in novels, right? So this whole notion, this whole variable about whether they're deceptive, whether they try to mislead audiences, this was also in another answer choice that was A, mentioned something about being deceptive. If you know something about one of the two and you don't know something about the other, well, then that's totally irrelevant, right? In order to prove whether two things are inequivalent to each other, you have to know that one specific variable is true for one and false for the other. So E is just giving us information about the course of a play. It has nothing to do with the novel, so it's not going to help us prove anything, right? And it's not the assumption we were looking for. The assumption that was laid out for us very implicitly in the paragraph was that since they used as support for their conclusion that the chorus sometimes produces inconsistent information, and we're using that to prove that it's not equivalent to the narrator of a novel, we must be assuming, therefore, that the narrator of a novel never produces inconsistent information. So that's the assumption we're looking for. E is not that, and therefore E is wrong. If you found this video useful, don't forget to hit subscribe. And for thousands more clear LSAT explanation videos, go to masterlsat.com.